All right. So our next unit is Unit 7. It's the 1960s and the Vietnam War. For this section, I kind of break it up where we just have the 60s and Vietnam War is a totally different section, but both of them will be combined for this one unit. If you take a look at these photos, I always like to start off with these photos, seeing if students recognize any of these people. You might notice JFK is the first one you would notice, Martin Luther King. This is JFK's VP, LBJ Johnson. Most students don't know him, but you will know him by the end of this section. We also have a lot of other stuff going on. We got Cesar Chavez here, Dolores Huertas here. These are farm workers, rights advocates, right? So we're going to talk about a little bit about that, the Hispanic, the Chicano movement. We have Chicano murals up here at the very top. You can see one of Cesar Chavez. We've got the space race. It's obviously an issue here. We've got the first man on the moon, Neil Armstrong. We've got the Berlin Wall, which we already talked about. We got the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we already talked about. So it happened at the early 60s. We included with the Cold War. But this is actually a continuation of the Cold War, because Cold War, again, does not end until 1990s. The last section that had a 1950s early Cold War was kind of first phase. Now we're going to move into something different, and you can see that on the screen with these protests about the Vietnam War, right? We've got Vietnam War there. We've got the Donald theory that led us to the idea of the Vietnam War. We got those that protest the Vietnam War, the hippies, right? They play a big role, brought to you by some of the music of the era. We even got women's rights as well, with liberation movements here. Again, we have Vietnam. The war in Vietnam is the main issue in the second half, led by this man here, Ho Chi Minh. And we also have civil rights in the 60s. Now, I do civil rights in a completely different unit because there's so much to include. So I typically make it clear that African American civil rights is its own unit, and then we do all the other minorities in the 1960s. But let's go ahead and get into that. All right, first we're going to start off with the new president elected in 1960, JFK. And if you know anything about the zero curse, that means he does have to die while in office. But most people know that happens to JFK regardless. Now, the election is pretty interesting. Again, I get into this in my class, but not on my recorded lectures, because more importantly, we just got to get through this. This is for students who missed. But this is the first time it's debated on TV. It does create a challenge. But JFK, when he becomes president, he has several focuses. He created the Peace Corps, which is irrelevant to state tests, but he does propose ideas like Medicare, civil rights, and increasing aid to education. When he dies, his VP, Johnson, takes over, and Johnson will fulfill those ideas. JFK was just like the start of it. He had the ideas, but Lyndon Johnson with the bills passed in Congress after JFK dies. JFK firmly believed in space exploration. He was the one that promised to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And you can argue we kind of did that because we had to prove that for him. In 1962, John Glenn would be the first American to orbit the Earth. The Soviets did it first. And by the end of that decade in 1969, the U.S. would be the first to land 2 men on the moon. So it does happen during the 60s, not while he's alive, obviously. But John Glenn will also later on, if you guys look this up later, he'll be the oldest man to go into space as well, much later. But that's a different generation. But nonetheless, this is JFK. This is what he believes in. This is the 60s, if you will. Not to go too into detail for this. So again, I have some questions for you to practice on. Hit pause at any point to practice a question, and then I'll circle it in 3, 2, 1. All right, JFK does get assassinated, and I won't go into details of it. It's really interesting. Students love this. We all often get into debates or topics about this and conspiracies. It's kind of interesting. For the purpose of this, it's all about stars, so I'm going to move on. You just need to know he does get assassinated, and his vice president, this man right here, will take over. Nicknamed LBJ, or known as Lyndon B. Johnson. All right, Lyndon B. Johnson, when he takes over, JFK was actually, when JFK was assassinated, he started his campaign for his re-election bid. And so when the LBJ takes over, there's only a year left in JFK's first term. And Johnson will finish that, and he'll run for re-election. And he promises, his campaign promise is the Great Society. And the goal of the Great Society was to open up opportunities, improve life for all Americans. So whatever bills to get passed, any programs that we're going to see that helps get rid of poverty, is essentially going to be part of the Great Society. LBJ thought, hey, America's the best country in the world, but people aren't living like that. What can we do to fix that? Here's a few things. We will talk about civil rights in another unit, like I talked about, like I already mentioned. We will talk about this later. He does introduce the idea of affirmative action. Technically, it's in the JFK executive order, the first time we see it. But this idea of affirmative action was this concept that we will help minorities and women have better opportunities, because in the past it's clearly been discrimination against. And the best thing I think of is, if you think of America, 1619, first slaves are brought over, and for the next couple hundred years you have slavery, right? Up until 1865. Okay, 1865 you finally end slavery, but the next 100 years you have Jim Crow laws, you have poor education, everything to keep this group of people down. So now Johnson's making the argument, like, we can't just all of a sudden snap our fingers and end all that. Things are different now. But he wants to make it equal. So he's going to ask for affirmative action. It really starts with the federal government at first, the contractors and federal government workforce. It asks that, hey, make sure a certain percentage of your employees are minorities. Make sure a certain number are women. You know, we want to represent the actual population. And if half the population are women, maybe half of our workforce should be women as well. Give more minorities more opportunities to get caught up, I guess you would say. That's affirmative action. And it spilled over into universities as well. Universities would set aside, at first, they would set aside 10% of their upcoming freshman class that they accepted would have to be African American, for example, or Asian, or female. That was the idea behind affirmative action. Now, he also does create a few other things. He declares a war on poverty. If you ever see that phrase, that's a Johnson phrase. And the idea is that we mobilize everything we got to win this war on poverty. He will have the Economic Opportunity Act, create new government to administer programs like Job Corps. Job Corps essentially was training to underprivileged youth, underprivileged people in poor cities, typically. Still exists to this very day. And so it was the idea to get them some training so they could actually get real jobs and connect to companies. He also introduces the Medicare Act. This is healthcare, essentially, healthcare, hospital insurance, post-hospital nursing for anybody over the age of 65. So Medicare was for older people. Medicare Act of 1965 was anybody over the age of 65 could essentially receive medical health insurance, if you will. Anything that has to do with aid to cities is important as well. Johnson looked at these urban areas and saw how some of these places were run down, they're poor areas. He said, we need to put money back into the cities to make them more habitable, make them better. And that could be money for urban planning. It could be clearing out old buildings, slums, rental assistance for the poor. So you might think of Section 8 housing as right now comes from Great Society programs. So he was trying to fix the urban areas specifically as well. Now he wins in a landslide, easily wins. His opponent, Goldwater, kind of beat himself, really. And this used to be a TEK, it's not anymore, but it's worth mentioning. That Goldwater came in with these whole ideas about just, he was not afraid. He said nuclear war is not off the table. Like, we should be more willing to do that. He made a lot of threats. People didn't vote for him because they're afraid this guy's going to take us to World War III. And you can see this if you ever get to watch a Daisy commercial. It's an infamous commercial, only aired one time on air, and it changed the way political commercials were done. But nonetheless, Goldwater is known for reaching the idea of conservatism. Is at a point where if you're conservative, that was just out of date. I mean, this is a time period of civil rights. People demand equality, and everybody's saying, you know what, why not? People should be equal. So conservative was tied to keeping it the way it was with racism. He brought it in saying, hey, we need to limit the government. Like ever since the Great Depression, it's been out of control. And maybe we should go back to the way it was. The conservatism idea that we know from Reagan and then now currently Donald Trump all really begins with this guy right here. After elected, Johnson does get the Immigration Act of 65 passed. Never asked about on STAAR test. It could be. It is a TEK. It's too political, I think. But it got rid of the quotas. If you guys remember the quotas from 1920s that said, hey, only a certain number of people are allowed from this country and this country and this country, Johnson thought that was unfair. He said, hey, immigration, it shouldn't be limited to countries. Everybody should have a fair chance in America. So he opens it to everybody equally. Now, what that does mean is when you think about geographically, people don't flock across from Scotland to America to start lives. Anybody on that side of the world flocks to Europe because they have a good economy. Everybody on this side of the world flocks to the United States because we have a good economy. And so if we have accepted the same number of people from every country at a time, what that means is people on this side of the world, the line gets backed up. And that's become a big sticking issue. We've had small acts done in the past, executive orders and things like that. But this was the last time there was like a real immigration act in 65. This shows you how old it is, as both sides attempt to fight about it. And this is the first time immigration from Latin America would be limited. And it wasn't on purpose. It was simply that, hey, if you're from Mexico or from Scotland, we should accept the same number of people. Just geographically speaking, it doesn't make sense because more people are going to come from Mexico to the United States than from Scotland, because Scotland's a longer trip and people from Scotland can go to any part of Europe and find the same economy they find here in the United States. So on face, meant well, it creates a lot of problems here. We talk about 60 years later. And Congress still hasn't fixed that. Okay, so give a chance to answer this. Three, two, one. All right, these are some of the Great Society programs. I'll go over them briefly. Technically, STAAR can ask about any of these. We already talked about Medicare. It's for elderly people, health insurance for elderly people. Medicaid is for people with low incomes. So a lot of my students would know this. They're able to get braces, they're able to go to a doctor because they have Medicaid. The Child Nutrition Act, not as well known, but the whole school lunch programs came with this. Didn't exist before 1966. That was Johnson's part of, hey, people have poverty, let's put food in people's mouths. Seems like a good idea, right? The Education Act as well. The big thing from here that we see is the Higher Education Act will eventually lead to financial aid. Simple put, Higher Education Act was supporting college tuition scholarship, student loans, work study for students with low and middle incomes. It's not meant for people who are wealthy because people that are wealthy don't need it. This is to help people out of poverty, not help rich people get more rich. Project Head Start, preschool for disadvantage. This starts off as those that that are in a low income bracket. Some districts do firefighters, police, their children can go to preschool for free. The state just now passed an issue where I think even teachers now will be able to put their kids in preschool for free. But that's all unfolding in Texas right now. This war on poverty, he declares, part of it, maybe it's the Housing and Urban Development Act. I talked about that, aid to cities. Anytime you see anything about urban areas being fixed or money going to urban areas, I need you to think of the war on poverty, part of the major Great Society programs, the big overall programs. Out of all these, war on poverty is part of it. Consumer and environmental protections, actually passing laws that say we have to put a standard on what you pollute in the air and our water. We have to have some of that. Highway Safety Act to make sure the highway is a little bit more safe, speed limits and things like that. The Fair Packaging Label Act, people don't realize how important that is. Now they have to put ingredients in products and they have to be truthful. If they're not telling the truth, you can sue, and we see it happen all the time. Companies get sued fairly often because they lie about their claims. All this, the whole point of all these programs is to make society better. And it could be from their water, it could be in the urban areas, it could be in education, it could be in health insurance. This was the Great Society Johnson envisioned. But you're looking at it like, man, this is going to cost a lot of money. And you're right. And the main reason it fails, I mean, many of these still exist to this day, but the major impact they make is hard to measure, and some things kind of fall apart and don't go full development, it's because Johnson will get us deeper and deeper into Vietnam War for roughly a decade. We're pour tons of money into that. And we're going to pay for war way before we pay for education or health insurance or even fixing cities. We'll spend quite a bit of money on the Vietnam War and take money away from his Great Society programs. But it's often called, housing and urban development. All right, so try to pause the recording and try to answer this. Three, two, one. I don't like how they do that. All right, pause and try to answer this. Three, two, one. Now, the tough thing about this is HUD stands for Housing of Urban Development. Some students have trouble with that, but they always give you a bone to throw in Medicare. So Medicare is the easiest way to tell what that is. But HUD, not my favorite STAAR question, but I can't control that. Now, equal employment opportunity. I'm actually going to cross this out. You don't have to know this for a STAAR test. I am crossing my students' notes. It's part of affirmative action, and it's changed over time. Executive orders have added to it to the point where it covers many different aspects of it. But it's avoid politics, and now it's not on a STAAR test, so I avoid that TEK. Okay. Go ahead and try to answer this one. The bar graph shows historical trends in the U.S. workforce. Percentage of men and women in the U.S. labor workforce from 50 to 2010. Pause the video. Three, two, one. Okay, I'll also have this to show my kids examples of affirmative action to explain it so that my students see both sides of it. Again, for the purposes of this is STAAR related. You can pause this, take a look at these, and try to analyze them yourselves. We'll do it in class, but I'll skip through it. 3, 2, 1. All right, women's rights. We're going to get into one of the feminist waves that we have in America, 4 that we have. Well, now already 5 now, but can't write history as it happens. Nonetheless, women's rights becomes a big role in the 60s, partially because in the 40s, if you remember World War II, women were working in factories. They were saving America. They were helping. Without them, we couldn't have won the war. So very important. When the war's over, women went back into the workforce or back into the homes, held traditional roles as wives and mothers all throughout the 50s and most of the 60s. Movies, TVs, magazines, they really reinforced the stereotype. And if you didn't do this, you were an outcast. You know, it's kind of like you were the cat lady, right? The woman didn't want to have kids and families, the crazy ones, right? I'm being sarcastic, clearly. Now, women could vote. They could vote since 1919. But as far as full equality in the home or in the workplace, it was pretty bad. There weren't as many women working. There weren't any rights protecting women. There was not equal pay at all. We're talking about basic, like I'm a teacher, she's a teacher, I get paid more for no reason whatsoever, even if she has more work. I don't mean like, oh, hey, she's a secretary at a minimum paying job and this guy works in some factory somewhere and gets paid more. I don't mean that comparison. I mean, same career, women got paid far less and weren't represented in that career. But all this was part of the problems. And this is what engages the women's liberation movement. And of course, I love this cartoon. I think it's sarcasm. It's awesome. Now, the many of the reasons why women emerge, this first movement emerged so much is there's dissatisfaction. Like I said, women are, I think the way it was put was that women did all this work, got the lunches ready, got the kids to school, cleaned the house, cooked dinner, did everything. And at night they had to lay down and think, is this all my life really is? And they had to reflect on that. And so there became a growing dissatisfaction. The civil rights movement does play a role. I know I haven't talked about that unit yet, but that influenced a lot of other minorities to say, hey, these people are right. Why can't we all have equality? Why can't we do it? And the women's movement will use some of these techniques like sit-ins, lobbying to Congress, sit-ins, demonstrations, boycotts, and strikes, Women and all these rights movements will borrow that from the civil rights movements. Civil rights movements has a huge influence on everybody. Social science comes to Margaret Mead is an interesting character. She is the first to point something out. She said, "Hey, women's low status in Western Hemisphere society, like our society, Europe and America, women have a low status, and it's not maybe it's not because they're biologically inferior. Maybe it's not because that. Maybe it's because society is male-dominated structure, and the males have kept women from rising, and so this became a massive debate that well maybe women aren't inferior. We've just forced it on them. So Margaret Mead introduced that idea, and it takes off quite a bit. There's sexual revolution, as we have here. This has everything to do with the birth control pill. Now the birth control pill is out there, and it was liberating. Women had control of their future for the first time ever. And then don't get into dynamics, say you just don't do it if you don't want to get pregnant. That's not always the case, right? But this meant women could plan their future and had actual control of their lives for the first time. It was a game changer. There's lots of leadership within the feminist movement, like Betty Friedan, which we're going to talk about her in just a second, and other ones as well. Betty Friedan would write a book called the Mystique. And you do have to know this for a start. Her book, Mystique, inspired women. It said that you should be treated equal with a man, and you can compete for the same jobs with the equal pay. You don't have to stay at home, cook dinner every night, and bare feet in the kitchen and do what you're told. You can be something more. And it caught a lot of traction. She was a great leader in the women's liberation movement, as this is called, or feminism, nonetheless. She does help form NOW, which is a national organization for women, obviously fighting for women's rights. And it was in education, employment, and just a new attitude altogether, how we talk to women, treat women, it was important. Now, this part about Roe versus Wade, obviously that's changed quite a bit, but also it's not even covered in TEKS. Roe versus Wade was technically part of the TEKS, but it was never even asked about in the STAAR test. Nobody wants to touch that. All right, so example STAAR question. Pause the video to answer it. I'll be answering in 3, 2, 1. Title IX. Now, Title IX is actually really difficult to get into the details of it. I mean, lawyers specialize in this, but it's pretty interesting. Flat out, for the purpose of state tests and any test, it bans sex discrimination in education facilities, meaning that women and girls have to have the same treatment as men. Right? So you can't pay a coach less if they're female, right? But it also spilled over in sports. They're going to put this much money in men's sports from the states. That same money has to go to women's. And you're thinking, what's the big deal about it? It's all about opportunities. Before Title IX, 1 in 27 girls played varsity sports. In 2001, 1 in every 2.5. So say 1 in every 3. That's a big difference. And you're thinking, well, what does that have to do with education, sports, academics? If you've been to any rural area or been to any lower economic area, you know that sports is a drive for some students. And actually, with our pass to play rules here in Texas, you see this all the time. Students show up for school and do good in school for the sport part of it. So it does have an effect. So sports in general, as much as I hate and they distract students, they do play a key role in student success sometimes. Now, Title IX clearly works. More men attended college than women before Title IX. Today, there are way more women than men in colleges in general. Women just are very successful in education and academics, and that actually comes with lower birth rates. And part of that is appeal, part of that is just society. Any advanced society has lower birth rates. Any third world countries have higher birth rates. Now, the struggle for equal rights does not end with women. We're going to see, obviously, civil rights for African Americans are our main focus. There's a whole unit for that. But we're going to see it through other, for youth, Hispanics, or Chicanos, actually, to be more politically correct. Chicanos, the youth, even Native Americans, we'll talk about them, all their struggle for the rights. Now, there are a few questions like this on the STAAR test, but they're pretty simple. So I'm going to let you try to answer it. So go ahead and pause it and try to answer it. And I am going to answer it in 3, 2, 1. See. So even though, and I always put this in there so you can see the TEKS, it's very broad. It explains how the contributions of people of various racial, ethnic, gender, and religious groups shape American culture. We don't teach you every single one of these. That would be impossible. But basically, reading about it, looking at them, you can see clearly they're fighting for something specific. And it's not child labor. It's not immigration quotas. Like some of these might be, oh, that's Japanese immigration quotas. It's not what immigration quota is. That would be the opposite of it. Lobbying against equal pay for equal work. I wouldn't say against. There's no way any of these to say, hey, I don't want to be paid equally. This is a typical STAAR question where it's like, it's very, the TEK's very vague, and you're supposed to be able to figure out the answer from what you were taught about the 1960s and the push for equality. The Chicano Movement. Sometimes it's given a negative name for some reason. I don't know why. Some students don't like the word Chicano. But in the 60s, it was the name for this movement. And it was to fight discrimination, racism, exploitation in 1960s America for Chicanos. The Mexican Americans, the main focus was voting and political rights, but farm workers are the main focus for STAAR test. Hector B. Garcia is a World War II veteran who became a leader instantly when he was fighting how Mexican Americans were often not allowed in restaurants, hospitals, pools, like limited equal employment opportunities. At his point, he knew a veteran that couldn't get buried in a local church in Texas because the church did not allow Mexicans to be buried there. And it was a Catholic church, but they didn't allow Mexicans, even though this guy was a World War II vet. So Garcia, as a World War II vet, became famous for the stand he took against these discrimination policies. But people often think civil rights were only for African Americans, but especially in Texas, Hispanics had to fight as well. And guys like Hector B. Garcia, some of the first leaders. As far as STAAR test is concerned, two people you have to know in this case, Cesar Chavez, which most people do know. He is going to organize boycotts against giant farms. Farm workers don't have the same rights as factory workers. Never was written like that in those laws. And these guys are working all day in literally bloody circumstances, not giving lunch breaks, horrible conditions, and there's nothing they can do about it. So he wants to fight for farm workers' rights, and he does it through boycotts, strikes, things like that. The most infamous one is these wine company. He's going to lead a boycott to stop buying grapes, specific grapes from specific companies, because this one wine company was using it. And he does very well in this boycott. Dolores Huertas will be actually his kind of partner in that. If you look into this, these two actually did not like each other that much. Chavez was not a 100% perfect guy, as we start to realize it much later. But nonetheless, Dolores Huertas is important too. She is going to form the United Farm Workers. Cesar Chavez is kind of the front face for it, but she does a lot of work. Later on, she'll fight for women's rights, immigration reform, and the environment. She's a really good person. Like, she fights the good fights. This guy actually used the word wetback before, even though he fought for farm workers' rights. So he's kind of history looks kind of down upon him, but all history is not fully both point of views, and we should work on that as a society, but that's a whole different story. So give it a try, pause. Always notice the top bumper sticker in 1970. The answer is D. This presents a work of civil rights advocate of accomplishments of Dolores Huerta. Okay, pause it. Three, two, one. All right, these other ones always talk about farm workers and farmlands and discrimination, but she didn't seize anything. It was about segregation for farm workers. Farm workers were about equal rights as far as worker rights. Armed resistance was not part of this. I once heard a teacher, and this was wrong for her to say, but she was an older teacher. She just taught Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta as the Martin Luther King for Mexicans. And I was like, that's so wrong. But she was an older woman, and I was like, at least you're teaching him. But It's not the same thing at all. Even though, just like Martin Luther King, they do share nonviolent policy. Chavez actually goes on a hunger strike at one point. It's all in that. And if you guys get a chance to watch the movie Cesar Chavez, you'll see that. I have a video clip link on my PowerPoint here. But nonetheless, it's all about negotiating with United Farm Workers, fighting for workers' rights, specifically farm workers. All right, try to answer this one. 3, 2, 1. Working, wages, labor conditions. They don't. We say workers, they say labor. We know that. It's not right to vote. It's not citizenship requirements. Nothing to do with immigration. Not influence on foreign policy for sure. Don't just because they say something about citizenship or immigration. Don't think that Chicanos is always a focus in history. The Chicano mural movement has been asked a couple of times, but the Chicano mural movement is important. We see these all the time. We take them for granted, these giant murals. They begin to emerge maybe in Southwest U.S., think of especially Southern California. These artists would use these giant blank walls to paint murals. And part of this is Diego Rivera. He is a Mexican artist that goes way back, married to Frida. Everyone knows Frida, but Diego is a cheater. He's the one that cheated on her. He painted giant murals for Mexican history and culture. And so this new generation came along, was doing the same thing. But at first, it was more graffiti, so they said that. But it is a way to support your culture and identity in a time where you couldn't do that in very many places for the Chicanos of America at the time. This gave them that outreach. So let's try a question. It's an older question. Pause it. Three, 2, 1. These questions are actually pretty simple when it comes to STAAR test. The American Indian Movement. AIM, AIM, was essentially the same thing but pushed for Native Americans representation. They coined the term Red Power. They were occupy areas like Wounded Knee, which was a famous battle that was more of a slaughter. Alcatraz, they occupied Alcatraz prison after it was deserted and abandoned. They occupied it for quite a while. These are state park or national parks, national sites. They would occupy it. They even did a remake of the Trail of Tears, but giant caravans of it. So these guys were trying to get attention. They said, hey, it's everybody else is getting all these, but we've been here the longest and nobody's recognized us. And so that was their push. Red Power, AIM stood for American Indian Movement, to push for Native American rights as well. Go ahead and try to answer this. This actually works better if you had done the civil rights, so it's kind of not fair, but it's going to be H, the march. As they all gathered to go to one area, that was it as well. This is a horrible question, to be honest. It's not labor, so you cross that out. It's not burning draft cards to Vietnam War. That's actually in the second half of this. This is a STAAR question, which is given to you at the end of the year. So, but this isn't the best one, but the answer is H. As far as court cases go, Miranda versus Arizona is a important one. I added this into this section because I felt it went along with maybe not civil rights, but rights. And it did happen in this time period. But essentially, this man was arrested for kidnap and rape. And he's interrogated for hours. He's never told that he can get a lawyer. He confesses. And he says, I did it, signs a paper. And then in court, he's like, no, I did not do it. I just signed it because I felt like I was forced to do it. No, I didn't do it. But they've used the confession in court to find him guilty. And so eventually went to Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court of the United States, SCOTUS, ruled that law enforcement must tell you your rights, specifically your fifth right, which is the right to remain silent. Anything you can say can't be held against you in a court of law. And your Sixth Amendment, which is the right to attorney. You have the right to attorney. And now it actually has to be paid for. Before, they'd say you have a right to attorney, but if you couldn't afford it, then oh well. But now it's going to be paid for because it's technically a right. And before questioning them, okay? So that's why oftentimes police do it as soon as you're arrested. And then they do it again once you're brought to the station just to make sure. Because if you've not read those rights now, your case can get thrown out. But Miranda was the court case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court that said, hey, You actually have to tell people they have the right to remain silent. They have the right to attorney. If you don't tell them that, then any statement they say cannot be used in court. You can't do that. If you're wondering what happened to Miranda, he did go back to lower court after this was confirmed, and they had an eyewitness that he had confessed all these things to, and he does go to prison for his crimes. But now these people have that right and know that right. Let's try to answer this question here. Only 39% of students got this right. Usually most of the questions will show you like plus 50, and so I don't ever worry. But when it gets under 50%, I like to point out that sometimes we just need to focus a little more on certain things. The answer comes in 3, 2, 1, when the suspect is arrested. If you've been arrested, you know that. Hopefully you have. Youth culture. This is the hippies. These guys were the counterculture movement. These are the ones that were against the man. They're anti-conformity, right? We always talk about beatniks were the first ones. The hippies grew out of this. And the ultimate hippie fest was Woodstock. Hundreds and thousands of people would descend on Woodstock. Well, it's supposed to be 50,000. Was nowhere near that. And this was a 3-day festival of singing, peace. When we look at those that became anti-war and anti-government, that was the hippies that led to that actually led that movement. They were the counterculture. TEKS always refers to them as the counterculture movement. They were against the mainstream culture, and they had a huge influence, and you'll see that. And of course, always know that the ultimate gathering of hippies was at Woodstock, and they did promote peace and love, and a lot of drugs, lots of drugs. All right, go ahead and pause this and try to answer it. I always like to point out rock is being married to folk music, and the offspring is protest. And anytime you see that, you know that's more than likely going to be some hippie stuff. That's Woodstock. All right, the 26th Amendment, along with all these massive protests, these anti-war counterculture movement by the hippies, it extended to students, people that weren't hippies. Like in these pictures here, like that does not look like any hippies here at all. Kent State shootings. These college students were peacefully protesting the Vietnam War as it raged on, and they were shot by the National Guard that were called in at the time. Nobody knows why or what happened, but essentially 4 students died. And if you thought people were anti-war, the Kent State shootings even amplified anti-war as well. And when you look at this idea, this concept, you could be 18 and get drafted to war. Okay, 18 years old, you could go to Vietnam War and die. And so students at college were protesting for their friends and families and the country itself. And they died. They weren't old enough to vote. Back then, it was 21. You're not old enough to vote, but you're old enough to be shot by the army. You're old enough to be drafted and die in the Vietnam War, but you couldn't vote for the guy sending you to war. And so in 71, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18, from 21 to 18. Primarily, the idea was that if you can be drafted to the war, why can't I vote for the guy sending me to war? The Kent State shootings amplified that. They actually amplified the whole anti-Vietnam movement as well. So it's pretty hand in hand when we talk about 26th Amendment and the Kent State shootings. Last question, and we're done. Pause it. And the answer comes in 3, 2, 1. Answer is A. All right, next we have the Vietnam War. This one's kind of short and fast to the point. Vietnam War would be a little bit longer, and there's a lot more information to absorb.